Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 592. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. I have a lot to talk about on today's show, a lot of very important stories to get through, so be sure to share today's show, recommend it to people. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute, on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show, and of course it's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. Follow me on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_. I tweet out almost all the articles that I talk about in the episode. So if you're ever looking for links, that's a good place to find it. I also post everything that I write, all the episodes of the show. So it's a great way to keep up with all the stuff I got going on. All right, let's get into the show today. First up here, White House announces new $400 million arms transfer to Ukraine. This package includes, and this is all according to the Department of Defense press release, additional munitions for Patriot air defense systems, additional munitions for National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems, Stinger anti-aircraft systems, equipment to integrate Western launchers, missiles, and radars with Ukrainian systems, additional HIMARS and ammunition, 155mm and 105mm artillery rounds, Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, M113 armored personnel carriers, MRAPs trailers to transport heavy equipment, tow missiles, Javelin and AT-4 anti-armor systems, precision aerial munitions. I assume those are JDAM kits or bombs equipped with JDAM kits. HARM, those are the high-speed anti-radiation missiles, small arms and additional rounds of small arms ammunition and grenades, demolition munitions and equipment for obstacle clearing, coastal and ravine patrol boats, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear protective equipment, and spare parts, training, maintenance, and other ancillary equipment. So that's an awful lot for $400 million. The Patriots are millions of dollars a piece, and a lot of these other systems are not very cheap. So I have to imagine there's not a whole lot of any of these systems going to Ukraine. Nothing really stood out to me as unique or new. Again, I do assume the precision aerial munitions are just JDAMs, but those are some other kind of surface to or air to surface missile or something like that. That could be significant or worth noting. Of course, this comes as Russian forces made significant gains in northeastern Ukraine, and part of what I'm thinking is happening here is that the U.S. is really scraping near its red lines for a lot of these weapon systems that is sending to Ukraine. So, say the Patriot missiles are something like that, and they're only able to send a few, maybe a dozen of these different systems to Ukraine. But as Ukraine is getting increasingly desperate and running out of these munitions, the U.S. is basically just throwing together what they can and sending Ukraine arms. And so this is part of the reason I'm sure they're doing this is Russian forces made significant gains in northeastern Ukraine. This from Dade DeCamp, May 12th, antiwar.com. Russia has launched a new offensive in northeastern Ukraine in a border region of the Kharkiv Oblast, and the Russian Defense Ministry has reported that its forces had captured 9 villages since Friday. The Ukrainian commander-in-chief, Syrsky, has not confirmed the extent of the Russian gains, but said his forces were facing an increasingly difficult situation. This week, the situation in the Kharkiv region has significantly worsened. And if that's what the Ukrainians are saying, I think you could probably assume that even if the Russians aren't necessarily, are maybe exaggerating somewhat, it does seem that the fight of the balance of the fight is tilting more towards Russia at this point. Local officials say that at least 4,000 civilians have fled the region since Russia launched its offensive on Friday. Much of the fighting is now centered around Volvachek, the largest village in the area, which is only about 3 miles from the Russian border. Russia's surprise offensive in northeastern has forced Ukraine to rush reinforcements to the area, stressing its defensive in other places where defensive lines are already at risk of collapsing. And it would be interesting if Russia launches a surprise offensive in this region, because that's kind of how Ukraine took this territory back in 2022, after Russia, during the initial invasion, captured large swaths of the territory, but I don't think really was holding it firmly either. Ukraine, there was a major offensive expected by Ukraine in the second half of 2022, and that was expected to come in the south, which is, the territory that people thought Ukraine really wanted. And we saw in 2023, I do think that was the case. And so Russia was preparing for Ukraine to go south, and Ukraine went north and was able to recapture a quite significant amount of territory. It seems that maybe Russia is doing something similar here. All right, next up, Ukraine's parliament passes bill to crack down on draft evaders. On Thursday, Ukraine's parliament voted to crack down on draft evaders, the latest step in a slew of legislation that's aimed at increasing mobilization as Ukraine is facing significant manpower shortages. The bill will significantly increase fines for Ukrainians looking to avoid being forced to fight Russian forces. The new legislation comes a day after the parliament approved a plan to have prisoners join the military, including murderers, as long as they have only killed one person. A Ukrainian member of parliament and member of the European Solidarity Party said the new bill will raise minimum fines for people trying to avoid the draft from $13 to $218. The maximum fine for people who have repeatedly violated the mobilization law increases to $5,200. According to Reuters, the average monthly wage in Ukraine is about $560. So that's not quite a year's salary, but pretty close. The bill needs to be signed by Zelensky to become law. Zelensky signed a mobilization bill last month that will come into effect on May 18th and lowers the age of draft-eligible Ukrainians from 27 to 25. Russian forces continue to advance in eastern Ukraine, and Zelensky said on Thursday that Ukrainian soldiers are facing a really difficult situation. And of course, the U.S. could really help Ukraine out here by trying to facilitate negotiations with Russia. I've talked about this in the past on the show, but it's been a while. A lot of people try to criticize the anti-war movement for saying you just want to abandon the Ukrainians. And of course, a lot of times, and I think, for good reason, we talk about in response to that how, well, the U.S. provoked this war and the Ukrainians wouldn't need defending had the U.S. not provoked the war in the first place. But it's also worth noting there was a lot of other things that really chafed at Russia that the U.S. has done since the end of the Cold War, such as putting the Aegis ashore missile defense systems that, could hold Tomahawk missiles, which of course could carry nuclear weapons in Eastern Europe, the military buildup of NATO, not just NATO expansion potentially to Ukraine, into the Baltic states and things like that, but really moving the NATO alliance's military hardware eastward as they've expanded the alliance, carrying out major war games in the Black Sea, in countries bordering the Black Sea, in countries bordering Russia. These things are also very significant. And if the West really wanted to, I think they could sit down with Moscow and say, look, we're not going to have Ukraine join NATO, so that's a major relief for Russia. Now, we know you've annexed and control a lot of this territory, but let's see what kind of concessions we could get. Let's see how much territory we could get back for Ukraine if we, say, agree to move some of our troops back westward in Europe, agree that, neither country is going to conduct war games within 100 miles of the border or so. We're really going to set up a standard that is going to reduce tensions in Eastern Europe, and maybe Russia will be willing to give Ukraine some territory back in exchange for that. And so, I think that is the path the West should be pursuing here. Want to mention here, Ukrainian shelling kills 11 civilians in Russia's Belgorod Oblast, and this has happened time and time again. I think this is what Ukraine is going to do in order to try to divert all the Russian forces they can from the invasion. It's a pretty cruel tactic, although, strategically, I guess they see some value to it. Just shelling civilian areas and trying to get the Russians to let up on their attack. All right, next up here. Congress targets TikTok allies ahead of legal battle. I think this is a really important thing going on, and it's not getting a whole lot of attention. But I think it's actually really huge and a huge sign that as an country, America is, on the decline and really in trouble when it comes to the rule of law. So as TikTok gears up to battle a law that will ban the video sharing platform, Congress is attempting to strip away its allies. NetChoice, a trade association representing major tech companies, no longer lists TikTok as a client. On Wednesday, Politico reported that NetChoice faced pressure from House Majority Leader Steve Scalise to dump TikTok. Another source said the trade group succumbed to pressure after it learned the Select Committee on China would be investigating groups associated with TikTok and decided to sever ties as a result. A representative of Scalise appeared to confirm the intimidation scheme in a statement to Politico. It should not come as a surprise to those representing TikTok that as long as TikTok remains connected to the CCP, Congress will continue its rigorous oversight efforts to safeguard Americans from foreign threats. Politico reported in March that members of Congress were considering whether to blacklist companies that represent TikTok. At the time, Tom Cotton said meeting with the head of TikTok is equivalent to taking a meeting with the Taliban or Hamas. A TikTok spokesperson blasted the Select Committee on China for intimidating its allies. He said the Select Committee's brazen efforts to intimidate private organizations for associating with the company with over 170 million American users is a clear abuse of power and smacks of McCarthyism. It is a sad day when members of Congress single out individual companies without evidence while trampling on constitutional rights and democratic processes. NetChoice has not issued a statement on its decision to drop TikTok as a client. The group claims to lobby for the First Amendment rights of its clients, which include Amazon, Meta, Google, just other huge tech companies. Now, when we talk about the First Amendment rights of its clients, I didn't really want to get into the particular article because I think it's kind of a complicated issue where NetChoice does seem to have a lot of influence. They have a lot of lawyers. They've written briefs that have been used in these legal battles to benefit these big tech companies. Now, I just want to say that this isn't a huge endorsement of NetChoice because it seems like some of the legal battles that they won were so their platforms could censor more, right? They're arguing with states saying that they should have the ability to censor on whatever grounds they want. And while I don't necessarily disagree that the government shouldn't have control over how these companies censor, I think we all these were state battles with individual states, and I think this in some way is almost a stand-in for the federal government at this point because of the amount of power that the federal government has over these platforms, particularly Meta, Google, companies like that, that when they're battling states in state court, the states are really trying to push back against the federal control over these companies. And so, it's far more complicated than this being a private company issue, right? I don't think that's really where these companies stand on the First Amendment. And again, I think they're almost a stand-in in the courtroom for the federal government because obviously it would be wrong if the federal government was covertly making these companies censor certain political positions, which we know is happening thanks to Matt Taibbi and the rest of the crew that published the Twitter files. But so just so you understand that the nuance here of what NetChoice is and who NetChoice is. Now, the reason I think this is particularly important, again, is that this company seems to have a lot of success and power when it comes to courts and influencing. And Senator Rand Paul has explained that he says he thinks TikTok will be able to prevail in court. However, I think in the American courtroom, having these kind of allies to write these briefs is probably pretty significant in winning your court battle. And so Congress could really kneecap Twitter here, or TikTok here, and make it so they can't beat this ban, which of course I really don't care about TikTok. I don't use TikTok. However, I do see the ramifications for other platforms. And additionally, I do know that TikTok has been a pretty important platform for spreading the message about the pro-Palestinian message since October 7th, and doesn't seem to be as controlled or moderated by the American government. So back to my article here. The pressure on TikTok has been building for several months as users of the platform have shared overwhelming pro-Palestinian content. Senator Mitt Romney recently admitted that it was a concern for Israel's public image that caused Congress to finally pass a law that banned TikTok. The bill, which President Joe Biden signed into law as a part of the $95 billion foreign military aid legislation, gives TikTok's parent company ByteDance 9 months to sell the video sharing platform or face a ban in the US. ByteDance says it does not plan to sell TikTok and will challenge the constitutionality of the law in US court. And so that's really the battle that's being impacted here, is if lawyers aren't willing to work for TikTok because they're going to get investigated by Congress, then how are they even supposed to challenge them in court? I mean, it would be hard to take a job knowing that you're going to face investigation from a congressional select committee. I mean, they could really look into and disrupt and ruin your life. All right, so on the actual U.S. relationship with China, this one here from Dade DeCamp, May 9th, antiwar.com. Chinese military monitors U.S. warship transits through the Taiwan Strait. So the Chinese military said that it monitored the transit of a U.S. Navy destroyer that sailed through the Taiwan Strait on Wednesday, which came as the U.S. and the Philippines are conducting major drills in the region. Colonel Li Shi, spokesperson for the Chinese Military Eastern Theater Command, condemned the USS Hazley's transit and said the Chinese air and naval forces monitored the ship throughout the entire process. And I do have some concern. This, I think, was really going on a lot during the Obama administration, maybe even a little bit during the first part of the Trump administration, where it wasn't just that there were the ships were monitoring each other, but there were times where they were coming very close, the Americans and the Chinese ships, to running into each other and things like that. We've seen this during the Biden administration, certainly with aerial exercises, close encounters between Chinese warplanes and American spy planes, things like that in the skies around China. We're always talking about here, or at least almost always, in the skies and the water surrounding China. We're not talking about the skies and the water surrounding the United States of America. And so if China is starting to monitor the U.S. ships maybe a little bit more aggressively, are they going to try to disrupt the U.S. ships to prevent them from doing a Taiwan Strait transit? Maybe, I'm not sure. The U.S. continues to do these on a near monthly basis. All right. Next up here is an article I wrote for antiwar.com on Friday, May 10th. 8 agencies are running out of food as Israel expands assault on Rafa. So as Israeli troops are expanding their operations in Rafa, civilians report food is running out, and at least 100,000 have fled the city. Al-Qassam, the armed faction of Hamas, says it has engaged the Israeli Defense Forces around the city. At least 1 million internally displaced Palestinians were taking refuge in Rafah before the assault began. So an official for the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, who is working in Rafah, said that 110,000 Palestinians have now fled the city. He slammed the Israeli attack for causing an even more unprecedented level of an emergency. Rafah had a pre-war population of 250,000, but absorbing the internally displaced people in Gaza has increased the population to around 1.5 million. Most other cities in Gaza have been reduced to rubble by the IDF, causing widespread starvation and famine in northern Gaza. While the situation in Rafah was already desperate before the Israeli attack, Palestinians in the city had access to some food and assistance. Al-Qassam says it has inflicted some casualties on the IDF in Rafah. A statement from the group claimed it killed and wounded several Israeli soldiers in a complex and simultaneous operation in Rafah. The IDF stated it in turn killed several Palestinian gunmen. On Monday, the IDF seized control of the border crossing between Egypt and Gaza near Rafa. That crossing has been used to bring most of the aid into Gaza since October 7th. Since Israel gained control over the Rafa crossing, aid trucks have been unable to deliver food and other life-saving assistance into Gaza. The OCHA official said the attack left the World Food Program WFP without a way to bring additional assistance into Gaza, and it will run out of food to distribute on Saturday. Sam Rose, an official for the UN Palestinian Aid Agency, that's UNRWA, explained, "No aid has come into Gaza now since Sunday. No aid, no fuel, no supplies, nothing. We're really now down to our last reserves." And that is last Sunday, by the way, not yesterday, so 8 days ago now. Rose said that UNRWA's ability to aid Palestinians will be plagued not just by lack of food, but also water and fuel. We have a few more days of flour that we could provide, but everything else will shut down very soon without fuel, without water. So the situation is desperate, he explained. Hamish Young, a senior energy emergency coordinator for UNICEF, that's the UN aid agency for children, explained, "For 5 days, no fuel and virtually no humanitarian aid has entered the strip. We are scraping the bottom of the barrel. The lack of fuel could grind humanitarian operations to a halt." A Palestinian doctor said the fighting knocked out one of Gaza's hospitals in Rafah and severely limited the services of another. Al-Najjar Hospital is out of service, and the Kuwaiti hospital in Rafah is just for trauma and emergency. We have no beds, no hospital to refer people to, especially critical patients, he stated. Washington and Tel Aviv initially indicated the operations in Rafah would be limited, and President Biden gave his blessing to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu during a phone call. The White House has threatened to suspend some arms shipments, specifically large bombs, to Israel. However, an Israeli official said Tel Aviv has all the weapons it needs to finish the job in Rafah. On Friday, the IDF pushed into Rafah with Israeli tanks establishing control over the main road dividing eastern and western halves of the city, while Tel Aviv ordered residents and refugees out of eastern Rafah earlier this week. Residents said the IDF is pummeling the whole city with airstrikes. Netanyahu said Israel's operations in Rafah will be completed even if it means losing support from Biden. "If we need to stand alone, we will stand alone. I have said if necessary, we will fight with our fingernails." And that is something he posted on X. The White House says it opposes operations because it does not believe attacking Rafah will lead to the defense of Hamas. White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said last week, smashing into Rafah, in Biden's view, will not advance that objective, the objective of eliminating Hamas. Now, Dave has an update here on the situation in Rafah from Sunday. He says the UN Palestinian Relief Agency has said that about 300,000 Palestinians have now fled Rafah as Israeli forces continue to push further into the city. Rafah was sheltering an estimated 1.4 million Palestinians before Israeli forces launched an operation to capture the border crossing last Monday. The Israeli military ordered Palestinians to evacuate southeastern Rafah on Saturday, and it continued to escalate in the city despite warnings from the U.S. against a full-scale invasion. UNRWA wrote on X, "Forced and inhumane displacement of the Palestinian continues and stressed there is nowhere safe to go. Israel has suggested the Palestinians will go to the Al-Mawasi refugee camp on Gaza's coast, but aid groups say that it doesn't have the resources for so many people." Israel's closure of the Rafah border crossing has cut off vital aid deliveries, adding to the starvation blockade. And for 5 days, no fuel entered Gaza. Israel has allowed some to enter from the nearby Karim Shalom crossing, although not nearly as much as aid groups say is needed. And of course, they're going to have, I'm sure, a lot of logistical issues figuring out how to get the aid from that other border crossing to where it needs to go. There were established routes from Rafah. That was why the people in Rafah weren't starving to death yet. And this is awful. So according to the New York Times, Rafah has 3 major hospitals that were partially functioning before Israel launched its operation to capture the crossing. As a result of the attack, one has shut down completely. We had a statement from the Palestinian doctor on that in my article, so that's just more confirmation. Israel is also escalating in northern Gaza and has launched ground operations near the Jabalia refugee camp. Israel sent tanks into Jabalia after launching heavy artillery and airstrikes on the city, killing 19 people, according to Reuters. Al-Qassam brigades, the armed wing of Hamas, announced its fighters were engaged with Israeli troops on the ground in Jabalia. Gaza's health ministry on Sunday reported a total of 63 deaths across Gaza in the previous 24-hour period, and said the total number of Palestinians killed by Israel's onslaught since October 7th has surpassed 35,000 at this point. All right. Next up here, 2 more Palestinians killed by aid drops on Gaza. And so this isn't a surprise. I think the number now here is 21 total Palestinians have been killed by aid drops, and then an additional 12 have been killed while trying to retrieve aid that has gone into the city. And so this is just horrible what was happening to these poor people. The U.S. is pretending this is what is saving Palestinians, but not only is the aid drops themselves killing Palestinians, but the aid drops are propaganda. They're to show the American people that, oh no, aid is getting to these Palestinian people. And rather than either cutting off the Israelis completely or forcing Israel to allow hundreds, if not thousands, of aid trucks to pour into Gaza every day to save the starving children, then this is just a placeholder for doing one of the two things that really need to be done here. Again, it's either cut off Israel or force Israel to allow more aid into Gaza. All right, next up here, Representative Ogles introduces bill to send college protesters to Gaza. So Representative Andy Ogles from Tennessee, a Republican, introduced a bill in the House on Wednesday, designed to send college protesters to Gaza. According to Fox News, the bill doesn't specifically mention the protests against Israel's slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza that have swept college campuses across the country, but targets anyone convicted of unlawful activity. The full text of the bill hasn't been released, but the title says it will require persons convicted of unlawful activity on college campuses of institutions of higher education beginning on and after October 7th to provide community service in Gaza. He said the minimum amount of time the protesters would have to spend in Gaza would be 6 months. If you support a terrorist organization and participate in unlawful activity on campuses, you should get a taste of your own medicine. The Tennessee Republican also said he had expects protesters to be killed in Gaza, saying, I think I bet these pro-Hamas supporters wouldn't last a day, but let's give them the opportunity. And I think, kind of darkly here, I'm sure he thinks that Hamas is going to kill them or the Palestinians will just kill them. And I think it's far more likely that the Israelis would do so. The bill was co-sponsored by Representative Jeff Duncan, Republican from South Carolina, and Representative Randy Weber, Republican from Texas. It is the latest in a slew of legislation that's been introduced by Congress to crack down on the protests, which have been falsely labeled as anti-Semitic, despite the fact that Jewish students are participating in the demonstrations. The representative also introduced another bill targeting the protesters that would revoke student visas of foreign citizens who are arrested during the demonstrations. So, just a terrible human being. All right, next up here we have Representative Mills files article of impeachment against Biden for threatening to withhold bombs to Israel. So Representative Corey Mills formally filed articles of impeachment against President Biden on Friday due to his recent comments about withholding deliveries of heavy bombs to Israel if it launches a major attack on population centers in Rafa, Gaza's southernmost city. So Mills compared his move with the 2019 impeachment of then President Donald Trump for briefly delaying weapons shipments to Ukraine, and claimed Biden would abuse his power by trying to leverage military aid to get Israel to change its military tactics. So in a statement from Mills, it said, in a violation of his oath to faithfully execute the office of the president to uphold the Constitution, President Biden has abused the powers of his office by soliciting a quid pro quo with Israel while leveraging vile military aid for policy changes. This egregious action not only compromises the credibility of the United States, but also undermines the interests of our longstanding ally Israel. Therefore, President Biden's conduct warrants impeachment, trial, removal from office, and the disqualification from holding any future office under the United States. So this would, I think, actually be kind of hilarious and really smart if he really was just doing this to prove a point to the Democrats. Right? If this really wasn't about forcing Biden to deliver aid to Israel, which I think it is. Mills is somebody who is kind of a MAGA JD Vance type. I think he really doesn't support the war in Ukraine and really wants to bring that thing to an end. But he really does love Israel. I actually wrote an article about this guy because right after I think Dave Smith was on Timcast or Rogan, this guy went on Timcast and was like, oh, Dave doesn't understand the Houthis in the Middle East. And so I wrote an article debunking what this guy had said. All right, next up here. State Department says Israel likely breaking law with U.S. weapons, but won't cut aid. So think about this. The last two articles we have, right? We have these Republicans in Congress who say, oh, we stand by the law and the Constitution and we love America and the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment. And they're going to say rah, rah, all of that. And then when it comes to Israel, they're willing to throw all of that in the garbage. Your right to protest means nothing. Your right to free speech means nothing. Your right to assemble means absolutely nothing. The president's ability to decide whether or not to send weapons overseas, that doesn't exist. The foreign policy consensus, the war state must win at all times. These people are spitting on and destroying the Constitution to support something, right? To support Israel when Israel is actually breaking U.S. law. So this here from Dave DeCamp, State Department says Israel likely breaking law with U.S. weapons but won't cut aid. So on Friday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken submitted a long-awaited report to Congress that says Israel has likely used U.S. weapons in a way that are inconsistent with international law, but claims there is no way to prove it. The findings won't impact the flow of U.S. military aid. The report, which was issued a few days late, fulfills a new national security memorandum that requires assurances from countries receiving U.S. military aid that the weapons won't be used to violate U.S. or international law. The U.S. is supposed to cut off aid if those assurances are deemed not credible and if a country is blocking shipments of humanitarian aid. Despite the mountain of evidence that Israel has committed war crimes in Gaza and the continued restriction on aid, the State Department deems the Israeli assurances credible and reliable, so to allow the provision of defense articles to continue. The report also claims it received credible assurances from Ukraine, Nigeria, Colombia, Iraq, Kenya, and Somalia. Regarding the restrictions of aid, the report says Israel did not fully cooperate in the first months of the onslaught in Gaza, but claims there has been a substantial increase in its efforts on humanitarian aid more recently. But just a few days before the report was issued, Israel captured the Rafa border crossing, the most vital channel for aid deliveries, and it remained closed. Also want to note here that if you actually look at the amount of aid trucks that were able to enter Gaza per day since the start of the conflict, from the second to third week of October to February, that consistently decreased from about 200, maybe 220, 230, all the way down to just above 50 in February. Now that rebounded a little bit, but has now, I think, fallen back off the cliff with seizing Rafa. And so the U.S. government just outright lies in official reports, and nobody in Congress pays enough attention to any of this to actually understand. We're in so much trouble here. So Blinken reaffirmed the report in an interview on Sunday. He said, when it comes to the use of weapons, concerns about incidents, we were given the totality of the damage has been done to children, women, and men, it is reasonable to assess in certain instances Israel has acted in ways that are not consistent with international humanitarian law. Humanitarian rights organizations have compiled evidence about specific Israeli strikes that have hit residential buildings that could not have been considered military targets and slaughtered large number of civilians. Back in November, 972 magazine, an Israeli outlet based in Tel Aviv, published a report that revealed Israel was intentionally targeting residential buildings and other civilian infrastructure in what it referred to as power targets. The U.S. has been flying surveillance drones over Gaza and likely has far more evidence of Israeli war crimes than is publicly available, but Blinken claimed Hamas' style of fighting makes it very difficult to determine, particularly in the midst of war, exactly what happened and draw any final conclusions from one incident. And so all Israel has to say is, we thought Hamas was down there, and the State Department will say, well, I guess we can't disprove it, so you're probably right. Disgusting. Absolutely disgusting. All right, last article up here. This is a little bit of good news. UN General Assembly overwhelmingly votes in favor of Palestinian membership. I wrote this one for antiwar.com on May 10th. The General Assembly voted in favor of a resolution that says Palestine is qualified to join the UN. The U.S. and a handful of allies were the only nations to object to the measure. To receive full membership status, Palestine must get approval from the UN Security Council, where Washington's veto has prevented Ramallah from passing the vote. On Friday, the General Assembly voted 143 to 9 to 25 in favor of Palestine becoming a full member. As the UN Security Council can grant membership, Friday's vote determined Palestine was qualified to become a member and recommended the UNSC take that step. The UNSC is dominated by its 5 permanent members, the US, UK, France, China, and Russia. Any of those states can veto any resolution. Last month, Washington vetoed a motion that would have granted membership to Palestine, which is why the General Assembly even took this up in the first place. An earlier draft of the resolution granted Palestine the rights and privileges necessary to ensure its full and effective participation, including the right to vote. Additionally, it would place Ramallah on equal footing with member states. However, that language was removed because of objections from the US, Russia, and China. And so what happened here is that initially the General Assembly was going to do an end run around the UN Security Council. They say, okay, UN Security Council, you can officially make Palestine the 194th member of the United Nations. However, we can make Palestine an effective member of the UN General Assembly, right? That was their initial plan and what they wanted to do. And the U.S. objected over concerns about Israel. And my understanding is that Russia objected over, I think, Kosovo, and China out of concern of Taiwan, because they thought, okay, if this happens for Palestine, then the U.S. is going to try to do this to say, make Taiwan an official member of the UN General Assembly. And so, you know, I don't think that Russia and China are perfect countries or anything like that. I always made this clear on the show. They have their own interest, and this is them acting in their own interest, even against the interests of the people of Palestine. So the final resolution that passed does not allow Palestine to speak on all issues, the right to propose agenda items, the right to reply in debates, the right to be elected as officers in the Assembly's main committees, and it gives Palestinians the right to involvement at UN conferences. So that's, other than the right to vote, I guess, is probably a pretty significant level of membership that the Palestinians now have at the UN. So U.S. diplomats said Washington would not support Palestinian membership until Israel gives its approval. U.S. Deputy Ambassador to the UN, Robert Wood, said before the vote, "We have said from the beginning the best way to ensure Palestinian full membership in the UN is to do it through negotiations with Israel. That remains our position." And so he's saying that the Palestinians never get UN membership. They never get a state unless Israel approves of it. And you have Israel, who were arming and backing and allowing to do what they do, openly saying we're never going to allow a Palestinian state. In fact, everything we do is to ensure that a Palestinian state is never created. So Wood said that the vast majority of the UN General Assembly supporting Palestinian membership will not alter Washington's position. He said this before the vote. This resolution does not resolve the concerns about the Palestinian membership raised in April in the Security Council. There should be a Security Council take up on Palestinian membership as location. As a result of this resolution, there will be a similar outcome. So he's saying the U.S. is going to veto it again. In a fiery speech before the vote, the Israeli ambassador to the UN compared the Palestinians to Hitler and the Nazis, and then fed a copy of the UN Charter through a tiny paper shredder. He said, "You have opened the United Nations up to modern-day Nazism. This makes me sick." And honestly, he's the one that makes the rest of us sick. All right, everybody, that's the end of the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. More later in the week.